In the mud, there were 4 straight lines. I would say about 8 inches long. And he said it looked like someone had raked their fingers through the mud. When they circled around the other side of the house and got to Tim's window, they saw what it was for. Now, above the top of the window, a good 7 feet up, were like 4 muddy streaks. And on the window itself were dozens of large, muddy fingerprints. And the glass wasn't cracked or broken at all, just seemed to be smeared with mud. And by this time, Patrick was fast becoming convinced, something strange indeed happened the night before. So before going out into the woods, John wanted to feed, the family's pigs, because they had pigs, and they had 2 of them apparently, fairly young, weighing around 40 pounds each. And the pig pen was, I'd say, about 100 yards away from the house, behind an old barn. And as they got closer, John became a little concerned because they couldn't hear anything making any noises. So, usually, they squealed like crazy, like, sorry about my pig impression. But usually they squealed like crazy when they knew food was near at hand, Pigs get very excited. So, but, this morning it was completely silent. Completely silent. They rounded the corner and the pen was empty. No sign of damage or struggle. The pigs were just gone. Just gone. And they searched the barn but found nothing out of place. So they decided to hit up, the woods and just try and kill this thing. It's the best plan they could come up with. It's a dangerous, just take it out. So they entered on the same trail John had used the day before. And John showed Pat the broken fence wire and told him again about the hare. And it was a bright summer morning, and John was surprised at the difference between, from the previous evening, like the night before had been really still and silent. And now the woods were really, really alive with bird sounds and small animals, and he showed Patrick the broken tree. And they, followed the creature's trail and found several more trees and larger branches, twisted and broken, And they could see large, faint impressions of footprints where the ground was soft. And, they followed the deer trail further into the woods and encountered nothing unusual. And by noon, they were both getting hungry, so they hiked back to the house for lunch, and they spent, the rest of the day poking around, but saw nothing more that was really out of the ordinary. So, just before dark that night, his wife and kids drive up, and Patrick was sitting on the porch with the guns, watching the woods, and his wife asked if they had seen anything, and John told her about the footprint and the mud on the window. You could just imagine her surprise. And Patrick had retrieved a pint of booze from his car, and was well on his way to getting smashed, and John decided that he didn't want a frightened drunk with a gun around his family, so he suggested that Patrick could go home. Nothing was going to happen anyway. So Patrick agreed and drove off into the night, and John continued to watch the woods. His wife brought out a plate of food and a Coleman lantern and a flashlight, and he told her he would stay out here and watch the house through the night. And before they went to bed, he went into their bedroom and with help from his wife pushed the king-size bed as far, from the window as they could get it. And they agreed that his wife and kids would all sleep in that bed for the night, and he would keep watch around the house. So she had grown up hunting and knew how to handle a gun, as good as John did. And so she insisted on keeping the shotgun in the room with them. So he agreed after making her promise, to ask for a name before shooting at anything. Everett replied, "John, please don't shoot it. Baby, please don't shoot it." So, anyway, there was a full moon that night, and John could see across, like, the field and into the inky dark of the woods, and the night air was filled with, sound of thousands of crickets, and the pond behind the house was full of, just full of croaking frogs, and as the moon rose higher, clumps of weed in the fields began casting sinister shadows. And, before long, John was seeing his big hairy creature sneaking up on him in each of them, like, he stood there, lit a cigarette, trying to get over the paranoia, trying to shake the fear and concentrate just on the task at hand. And as he smoked, he wandered to the edge of the porch and stood looking at the darkened barn, and he came across something different. Something was different, but he couldn't quite place it at the time, and the front of the barn, facing the house, was open. And the inky, like the moonlight was hitting it kind of from the side, casting the interior in deep shadow. And he stood watching the black opening as he finished his smoke and thinking about the missing pigs. Then he realized what was wrong. All the crickets and frogs had gone silent. And it was quiet as the inside of a mausoleum at night. That was his comparison. And he could hear the minute shrill buzz of his own nervous system. As he turned to walk back to his chair, he thought he saw a movement in that barn. And he looked intently at the opening, but, could make out nothing. And then he turned his head a bit, to one side, and saw what he said looked like two red eyes hovering about 8 feet off the ground. And he couldn't see them, if he looked straight at them. But when he arrived, when he averted his eyes, I'm jumping ahead. When he averted his eyes a little, they became clearer, he said. This is what he had told me, what my dad had told me. And they were deep, burning coal red, almost invisible in the dark. And every few seconds they would disappear when the creature blinked. So his heart began thudding in his chest, and he waited for it to leave the barn and approach the house. And he slowly backed up to his chair, never looking away, and picked up that .30-06 and walked back to the end of the porch and waited and waited. He stood looking at the blinking red eyes for what seemed like hours in this awesome showdown. And then the eyes blinked out and never came back. He watched intently, but could see no movement. He thought for a moment, then grabbed his flashlight, shined it at the barn. The flashlight was too small to penetrate the darkness of the barn from the distance. He had to get closer. And he was, none too keen about leaving the relative safety of the porch and confronting a glowing-eyed monster in his barn. But, he was damned if he was gonna live in fear in his own house. So he left the porch and began slowly working his way towards the barn, kind of taking his time, building up his courage. He got closer and could still see no movement. It had gone further into the house. He got within about 20 feet of the opening. His flashlight would now penetrate the gloom of the barn. So he moved the feeble, beams of light over the contents of the barn. An old tractor, he had an old pickup, boxes, buckets, boxes and buckets, and too many, just too many places for something to hide. Even something big as it was. And he cautiously walked closer, now shining the flashlight down the barrel of his rifle. So he stopped at the entrance and shined the light all over, searching the corners and under the vehicles, and he stepped into the barn, and every sense straining for sound or movement, totally on that edge. He walked around the pickup, tensing for a huge hairy arm to reach out and, just grab him any second. You could imagine the feeling and the paranoia of being in such a situation. He made his way closer and, to the rear of the barn without seeing anything, slowly turned around to leave, wondering if what he saw was a figment of his imagination. But he knew better. He both relieved not to have had encountered it in the dark barn, and frightened, and somewhat confused about where it could have gone all of a sudden. So, as he's walking out, he glances at the wide stairs leading into the hayloft, and he froze, because he knew with complete certainty that it had climbed those stairs and was waiting for him to walk out under the hayloft and would jump down upon him, right? So he couldn't move. He froze up. He was, literally frozen in fear. And he swore that he could hear the floorboards softly creak, and above him, as an enormous, weight edged stealthily closer to the, edge of the hayloft. So he stood with his heart pounding in his ears, unable to rather move or act, and suddenly there was a booming explosion of a shotgun, from the house, followed by his wife screaming, and his paralysis broke, and he bolted out of that barn towards the house, man, and completely forgetting what may have been in the hayloft.